Hello everyone. Yes, I am making yet another video about the new Puss in Boots movie. I just saw how well my last video did, like, insanely well. I just knew I needed to make another one.
I can milk you.
Honestly, it's kind of crazy knowing that, like, 250,000 people saw my face talking about a children's movie, but whatever. So, quick update on that from the editing chair. Apparently that video was blocked worldwide by DreamWorks, so I had to take it down and re-upload it. Which, as you can imagine, doesn't feel too amazing. Thanks YouTube for being a completely functional and awesome website. I hope this video doesn't randomly get blocked too. Anyway, so I'm an animation person. I studied animation in school, and I'd like to think that I have at least a decent understanding of how it works, but even I find it hard to appreciate sometimes. And I think it's because it's one of those art forms that's used to get you engrossed into the story of whatever you're watching. So the further invested you become into the film, the further the craft of the animation itself fades into your subconscious. So that's why in this video, I would like to take a few minutes to walk through some of the art and animation in Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, because it's really pretty and it deserves some recognition. I think the most apparent and heavily marketed aspect of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish was its painted aesthetic, and I think this choice was pretty significant for a number of reasons, but mostly because for the last few decades, 3D films largely looked kind of samey. Since the release of the first Toy Story movie, the trajectory of 3D has been geared towards achieving a greater level of photorealism. It's gotten to the point now where animated films can appear nearly identical to in-camera filmmaking. I recently saw a Pixar short, those short films they played before the movie, and it just blew my mind. Could you imagine showing this to somebody 50 years ago and telling them it's animation, that it's not actually real, people made it? Imagine the damage that would cause to their brain when they try to wrap their head around that one. While animated films are ultimately produced by corporations driven by profit, those films are made by creatives. People that have an instinct to break boundaries and experiment with art in ways we haven't seen before. And eventually that desire materialized in 2018 when Sony Animation released Into the Spider-Verse and the door was open to explore different and more artistic ways of making 3D cartoons. I think for me the biggest thing that sticks out about the art style of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish was how, despite being a 3D film, it utilizes many of the principles and techniques of 2D animation. Some things you probably already picked up on, and others might be a bit more surprising. I think one of the most significant aspects of this art style was how the character animation was rendered to resemble 2D hand-drawn animation. For example, during the in-between frames, which are frames that take place during the keyframes or key poses, if the motion is quick enough, the characters will straight up duplicate or distort heavily to the point where the models are almost unrecognizable. In hand-drawn animation, this is quite common. In fact, they're called smear frames. Simply put, the point of smear frames is that they help emphasize the speed and intensity of emotion by reducing the frames needed for an action. You might be wondering, if this is a common thing in animation, what makes it so special in this movie? Because 3D animation is focused so much on emulating in-camera filmmaking, smear frames have largely been avoided because, well, they aren't realistic. Instead, 3D films utilize the principles of squash and stretch to convey the same idea, but it's never to the same degree, I think. Some of my favorite smears include when Puss in Boots spins his way towards the stone giant, which he does quite a lot. It's like one of his signature moves or something.
I'll try spinning, that's a good trick!
Or when Death the Wolf is fighting Puss in Boots and every time Death dodges, there's a number of quick frames where he's multiplied a few times. I think these are probably my favorite. Or when Death breaks through the table and he spins his sickles and there's a few frames where he's holding like half a dozen of them. Basically, smear frames are everywhere in this movie, and it's a big part of why the action scenes feel so energetic and so fun to watch. Similar to smear frames, impact frames are hand-drawn effects used to emphasize the strength of an impact. They can appear as sparks or shockwaves occurring at the moment before a collision, and as frames of high color contrast or inverted colors to express a kind of flash of light. If you've watched enough anime, you're probably very familiar with impact frames. In the moment where Death the wolf breaks through the table, there's a few frames where the color becomes inverted before the table splits. That's a kind of impact frame. And in the final bouts between Death and Puss in Boots, you can see a wide variety of 2D animated impact effects. One of my favorite being this POV shot where the yellow shockwave casts a gold light over the wolf. Ain't that neat? Like smear frames, you don't really see impact frames utilized very much in traditional 3D films, because opportunities to use them while sticking to a realistic look are few and far between. I hope you're starting to see why I think breaking from realism can allow for a greater degree of artistic expression in animation. So the other thing that everybody noticed since the first trailer was the choppy animation or low frame rate. It was what made most people make the comparison to Into the Spider-Verse and is one of the most apparent similarities. What the? And I believe the utilization of a lower frame rate is again a way to mimic 2D animation. Oftentimes in 2D projects, the frame rate can actually vary a bit depending on where the animators decide to direct their time and resources, which results in some areas being choppy and others looking more smooth. And I believe this is the reason why in Puss in Boots the frame rate is so inconsistent, because it's mimicking the restrictions of 2D animation. One of my favorite moments is in the bar scene when Death knocks Puss in Boots' sword away, and when he goes to pick his sword up, you can see he's animated on twos, which is to say that each pose holds for about 2 or 3 frames. But the moment he picks the sword up again, each pose holds for 6 frames, which makes the movement noticeably more choppy. I love that the frame rate changes in a single shot with no cut. That's just awesome. If you pay attention, this variation in the frame rate occurs all over the movie, and my best guess as to the factors that determined which shots were choppier and which ones weren't had mostly to do with what moments the animators felt comfortable sacrificing the subtlety of the action for this effect. Because a high frame rate is able to capture more nuance in motion, shots that contained mostly simple movements were animated on 6s, and the more complex motion was animated on 2s. And finally, the film also heavily incorporates 2D elements into the background art and scenery. You know, in your standard 3D film, for the most part the set pieces and backgrounds that the characters inhabit are composed almost entirely of 3D modeled and rendered objects. This is mostly done for the ease of camera work, and of course getting everything to blend together during compositing. While Puss in Boots certainly uses plenty of 3D environments in the same way, I noticed that there was a heavy usage of 2D illustrations and assets to create the sets and mimic the 3D look. For example, in the shot of Puss in Boots getting shot out of a cannon, you can see that everything outside of the character is a painted 2D asset. Even the explosion from the cannon is painted frame by frame, rather than utilizing a simulation that could have performed a similar effect. In the shot where Puss in Boots is crushed to death while lifting, if you pay close enough attention, you'll see that the dumbbell is actually just an illustrated asset, motion tweened to appear 3D. Pretty cool. In many of these quick shots where the camera remains static, it seems the filmmakers elected to save time by simply skipping over the complex process of modeling and texturing whole environments. Like, that makes sense. Why spend all that time on such a lengthy process for a shot that's only going to be on screen for like 3 seconds? This is one of the main advantages of this non-realistic painterly art style, because it allows for a greater degree of efficiency and shortcuts. And while you might not see that in the final film, it's great for production. One of my favorite frames in the entire film is this establishing shot of the retirement home Puss in Boots is heading to. It's funny because they had that area modeled in 3D and used it plenty going forward, but they chose to leave it as an illustration here. In a similar shot, we see Puss in Boots leaving the church he was supposed to marry Kitty Softpaws in. Again, the entire landscape, including the church, is a matte painting. Honestly, I can't think of too many 3D films that were comfortable doing something like this. Even Spider-Verse wasn't this aggressive with its use of 2D art. So the question here is, what does Puss in Boots gain from merging the principles of 3D animation with 2D? What impression is it giving its audience that wouldn't have been possible if it stuck to the tried and true photorealistic look we're all used to? Well, I think it's quite simple actually. Imagine what the movie would have been like if it was rendered the same way as something like Onward was, for example. Do you remember the art of Onward?
Nope.
Like, Did it have a lasting impact on you? For me, it didn't. Like, at all. And I think the reason for that is the art style used in that film was about as generic and cookie cutter as it gets.
Damn.
It didn't allow for the fantasy story to feel as fantastic as it should have, right? And that's what Puss in Boots gains from its painterly aesthetic. Its animation is filled with energy and life in a way that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. I think it's also fitting because honestly, we're talking about a fantasy film set in a land far, far away. We shouldn't try to make that look like real life. Instead, I think it's better to indulge in the fantasy by having it appear as an illustrated children's book, right? Anyway, thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. See ya.